afternoon, everyone, and welcome and thank you for joining the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Today, we are holding our first program as the Maryland Center for History and Culture and our first virtual offering of our beloved Francis Scott Key Lecture Series, FSK from Home. I am Margot Copera, the museum's Public Programs Manager.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hillary Chang, Director of Individual Giving at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. As you might have seen when you registered for today's event, we created the FSK from Home Giving Challenge. Through this challenge, our goal is to raise $5,000, which would cover all of our public program expenses for the remainder of 2020. Normally, these expenses would be covered through ticket sales, but nothing about 2020 has been normal so far. We, of course, are bummed we can't hold our events on site, but we're so glad you're here with us virtually. We really hope you enjoy the program today, and if you haven't already, we hope you'll consider making a donation to our FSK from Home Giving Challenge through the donate button on the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much and enjoy the show.
So after 176 years, we are stepping into this new identity that better reflects our mission to provide space for the community to discover and develop a deeper understanding of our nation's history and culture through a Maryland prism. And to help the Maryland Center for History and Culture embark on this journey, we have invited this afternoon an independent museum educator with over 37 years of experience working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, engaging audiences with original works of art. So I am going to invite, please, Alice W. Schwarz to join us virtually. There she is. Thank you so much, Alice.
Hi, good afternoon. Let me just share my screen, pull up. Thank you. Thank you, Margot, for such a nice introduction. I'm very excited to be with you all this afternoon, and thank you for joining me. I do hope you all are healthy, happy, and safe wherever you are in this very uncertain time. And I'm also thrilled to be the first talk given by the new Maryland Center for History and Culture. My talk today not only focuses on an artist's depiction of historic events, but the intertwine of cultures of Europe, Indigenous America, and colonial America. So today, I'll be speaking on two history paintings by the German-American artist Emanuel Leutze. One painting on the left, Washington Crossing the Delaware, is owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And the one on the right, The Founding of Maryland by Lord Baltimore, is at the Maryland Center for History and Culture in Baltimore, our host today. Both paintings by Loytza were completed in 1851 and 1861, respectively, but their subject matter represents events of the 18th and 17th century. So together, you and I will delve into the 17th century, the 18th century, and the 19th century, not necessarily in chronological order, but actually weaving back and forth between the three. I also ask us all to keep in mind that we are talking about these works of art and visually analyzing them through 21st century eyes. We will always respond to works of art based in the time that we live, just as Loytza did in the middle of the 19th century. And I think it's fairly safe to say that we all, including I, experienced American history class through a series of lectures by our teacher or professor, and were asked at the end of the semester to write a final paper on all of the most salient aspects of the historic events we had just studied. We were to compose the perfect essay on events leading up to, the results that followed, the most important figures involved, and the fine details of dates, names, place, and historical significance. We did our homework. We studied hard to strive for that A. Well, I believe Emanuel Leutze was also that near perfect student, and I ask you all to think about these two history paintings as his final exams. These are not a Ken Burns series of films that slowly reveal the entire story of a historic time period. These paintings do not move, nor have sound, projects that we can so easily create today in the 21st century and share around the world, similar to the talk that I'm giving right now. Loytza's paintings are single, still images that could only be seen by some live, and they needed to captivate an audience to be appreciated for his brilliance in technique and composition. Though he spent much of his artistic career in Germany, Loytze wanted to be appreciated by the American public and seen as a great American artist. A history painter gets one chance and one chance only to depict the importance of an event in a single work of art. Objects and people may be included to tell this story, even when the artist knows they are not historically accurate. Because Loytze is painting these works decades, if not centuries, after the events, he also has the fortune to include people and objects in the works that he knows become important factors later in history. He takes the liberty, the artistic license, to include things in the painting that are not historically accurate. Dare I say, at this time in our history, fake news. I want us to consider what it means to depict an event one was not present for. And I also want us to consider what Loytze includes in his painting and what he chooses to leave out. So let us plunge in. And before we discuss the two works, I do want to give you a brief background about Loytze to bring us up to the creation of these two paintings. Emanuel Gottlieb Leutze was born in Württemberg, Germany in May of 1816. Around the age of 9, Loytze's parents immigrated to the United States for political freedom, settling first in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and then in Philadelphia. As a young boy, his father suffered a long illness and died when Loytze was 14. And all through his father's illness, Loytze was at his bedside and slowly taught himself to draw. At age 14, he abandoned his formal education and becomes an itinerant portrait and miniature painter to support the family. In his 20s, Loytze established himself as a very successful portrait painter, and the few small-scale history paintings he executed during this period were greeted with considerable praise, and he was encouraged to pursue his artistic education abroad. In 1840, at age 25, Loytze left for Europe, enrolling in what was then called the Dusseldorf School of Painting, also the Dusseldorf Academy, to study history painting. By this time, the Academy was part of Europeans' Romantic period, that is loosely from 1800 to about 1890. Paintings were meant to not only be seen as theatrical compositions, with skill in firm drawing, careful rendering of detail, a very strong color palette, and dramatic lighting, but also be a totally immersive, emotional, aesthetic experience for you and me, the viewers. Paintings were to instill awe or terror, surprise, and wonderment. And first religious in subject at the first half of the 19th century, by 1840, when Loytze is in Germany, history painting turned to quote-unquote real events, human triumphs and losses. And I think it's an important piece to the puzzle about Loytze's work. History paintings should focus on the scene that captures the significance of the event and its full meaning. highly theatrical inaccuracy, as long as the final product captured the height of the drama. In 1843, Loytza takes a trip to Italy for 2 years. And although we don't know exactly what works of art he studied, there are 3 artists that are known to have later influenced Loytza's own work. Battle of Kashina, originally a preliminary drawing that Michelangelo created in 1504. The fresco was never completed by Michelangelo because he was called away for this little new project called the Sistine Ceiling. What Loytza seems to have taken away from this work is the complex composition, the overlapping of figures, bodies twisting and turning in all directions. And I want you to note the faces, some that are in profile, some that are in 3/4 turn, and some that are facing us full on. Look at the twists of the bodies, the overlapping of the figures. I'll reference this a little bit later for particularly one of the paintings. Titian's Venus and Adonis, completed sometime in the 1550s. This work is part of the Met's collection. And again, we don't know which of the Titian works Loytza saw, but he references the strong color palette and the dramatic cloudy sky that you see in the upper right-hand corner. I also want you to notice the brilliance in the range of textures and weight of fabric from the heavy red velvet that Venus is upon and Adonis's fluid toga. Death of Socrates of 1787 by Jacques-Louis David, completed just before the French Revolution. This is the epitome of neoclassicism, with a precision of line, lack of visible brushstrokes, dramatic lighting coming from a source above, and a frieze motif where all of the figures create a horizontal band across the center of the canvas. I want you to particularly think about this work when we're looking at Washington Crossing the Delaware. And notice that from probably the prison window up on the very left high corner, a dramatic spotlight directly onto our main character in the center, Socrates. Upon returning to Dusseldorf in 1845, Loytza marries Juliane Lautner, a local German girl of a military family, and he painted himself and his wife as companion pieces upon their wedding. You can see what a beautiful portrait painter he was, with such details and precision. If you look at my cursor, you can see just the outline of his steel-rimmed glasses, a glint of where the light hits it, right at the corner of the ear. In her portrait, you can see his brilliance at depicting fabrics. And remember the Titian, the translucency of her white overcape and the sheen of her silk shawl. His portrait is now at George Washington University, and her portrait is at a museum in Stuttgart. Also in 1845, he opens his own studio. He becomes the focal figure of the American expatriate community in Dusseldorf, and soon considered one of the preeminent American artists living abroad. It's exactly what he was hoping for. And I think it's also important to know that Loytza was a political activist and believed passionately in America's democratic government. He supported the German uprising of 1848 against the Prussian king. He felt that American history was the final stage in the progressive movement of world history, and that liberty emerges from the ruins of oppressed people. I'm just going to repeat that because I think these themes are in both of these paintings. Liberty emerges from the ruins of oppressed people. In 1849, Loytza began painting what would become his most famous work, Washington Crossing the Delaware. His primary goal was to create a work of art that deliberately glorified George Washington, the colonial American cause, and commemorated a military action of particular significance. And remember, this is all on the heels of the 1848 German Revolution. Washington Crossing the Delaware is the largest painting that hangs in a frame that the Met owns. It is nearly 14 feet high, 22 feet long, and I do imagine that most of you listening today are from the Maryland area, but just for context sake, 14 feet by 22 is still the average dimension of a New York City studio apartment. So people live in the space of this enormous painting. The figures in the boat closest to us are life-size, and I do want to note this was not a commissioned work. I would like you to begin your eyes on the right side of the painting and slowly scan across. Think about the lighting, the colors used, the overall composition, and the configuration of the men in the boat. And as you look at this work, let us start with the basics and some facts of the actual event. Commander-in-Chief General George Washington convinced over 2,000 men to leave the warmth of their homes on Christmas night. 1776, to cross an ice-filled river in horrible weather condition to make a surprise attack on the Hessian soldiers fighting for the British. They left the shores of Pennsylvania, crossed the Delaware River, landed on the shores of New Jersey around 2 a.m., to walk 9 miles south to Trenton, where the Germans were sleeping. The Battle of Trenton was a huge success and changed the course of the American Revolutionary War. Loytza, painting this 75 years after the event, obviously knew the outcome and the key players. Loytza did his homework. He studied battle strategy maps, weather reports, diary entries, and accounts of the men who made the crossing, who was involved in the battle. He even made the crossing of the river himself. The land that you see halfway up on the right side of the painting is the shores of Pennsylvania, and the snow-capped land on the left is New Jersey. So imagine you're kind of looking south to Florida. Loytza includes snow, ice floes, and wind. Notice Washington's cape, the flag, and the scarf of the gentleman in red, to give a sense of the horrific weather they endured. A trail of men and boats that extend into the distance on the right depict the number of men involved in the crossing. And the most important figure stands tall, surrounded by men at work, shifting in the boat in all directions. Remember the Michelangelo Battle of Kashina work. The intense, strong colors of the men in the boat are set apart from the pale pastel colors of the sky. Note the repetition of reds, whites, and blues, and the rainbow-like lines that extend from the flag. Although Loytza knew the boats landed around 2 a.m., if he was being historically accurate, his canvas would be a black painting. And so a lone star in the sky above the bowsman indicates the change from night to morning, a dawn of a new day, and foreshadowing the dawn of a new nation. Let us begin with our main character, George Washington, fearless leader, standing in profile, surrounded by his men. And the point where his cape and the flag meet intersect at the center of the painting. Of course, Loytza, painting this in the 19th century, knows George Washington will be America's first president, and the flag, although not created at the time of the event in 1776, will be the symbol of the independent nation. Also note the young man in uniform holding the flag. I'll get back to him in a little bit. According to accounts by 2 American artists, friends of Loytza's, Worthington Whitridge, known as part of the American landscape tradition, and Eastman Johnson of the 19th century American genre tradition, we have an idea of Loytza's process and studio setting. For Washington Crossing the Delaware, he set up his studio with flags, cannons, and other artillery, if you will, to get him in the mood. His 800-pound canvas of Irish linen was hung on the wall, and scaffolding was constructed to reach all of the areas of the painting. He roughly sketched the composition in charcoal and red and would adjust it as he painted. These are two small drawings, about 6 inches by 10 inches, owned by the Met, that Loytza used to plan his image of Washington's head. You can see very slight changes he made from the pencil sketch on the left to the oil sketch on the right, just making refinements of the cape, the hat, and even the jaw structure in the face. But it was really the 1791 life-size marble sculpture by French artist Jean-Antoine Houdon that inspired Loytza's George Washington. The sculpture still stands in the Capitol building in Richmond, Virginia, and was and is still considered the truest 3D likeness of George Washington. Loytza had a plaster cast of the head sent to Germany as a studio prop. And I also want to point out that a bust sculpture may be rotated and sketched to look at from all different angles. One sculpture can produce numerous head positions. I'll get back to that as well. But if you think about the men in the boat with Washington. Loytza seems to be a stickler for details. He convinced the Patent Office to send him a replica of George Washington's uniform, that is now at the Smithsonian, and asked his artist friend to dress up in it and pose. On the right is a portrait of Worthington Whitridge that Loytza painted in 1856. Whitridge is the friend, remember, that documented quite a bit about Loytza's process. Well, Worthington Whitridge happened to be 6'4", approximately the height of George Washington, and fit the uniform perfectly. Worthington Whitridge writes a little bit later that he was paid by glasses of champagne poured down his throat in order to pose as Washington. Continuing with the details, Loytza includes images of a leader, a commander-in-chief. The sword that you see off of his left hip on the right side is a grip of green dyed ivory with silver strip decoration, a leather scabbard with silver trim. These are 2 brass finial stamps, wax stamps. The red that you see is carved coral. One would have been George Washington's initials. The other is his insignia of Commander-in-Chief. They are inlaid into the brass finials, and then on the right, the spyglass, to show not only looking to the future, but literally looking to the land. All these objects represent the military leader and strategist. So now we go to the bow of the boat. It seems important to Loytza to include both immigrants and American-born colonists that were part of the war. And if we focus a bit on the hats that the men are wearing in the boat, it gives us a significance of where they might have originally come from. The bowman is thought to be French-Canadian, with his raccoon skin hat, and although his shirt is this blousy green shirt that he wears is a little bit closer to 19th century style than 18th century style, nonetheless with his boots, crampons pushing against the ice. The man with the tan facing out at us represents Scottish, Irish, or Welsh. And the African on the far side of the boat is identified as Prince Whipple, a boy born in Ghana, Africa in 1750, came to America to have full academic schooling, but he was sold into slavery at age 10. He was purchased by General William Whipple and made a free man in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. If you go to Portsmouth today, Prince Whipple's house is a historic site for you to visit. Now back to the man on the right of George Washington. He is James Monroe. Loytza knew Monroe would become the 5th president of the United States and bases his image on the portrait that you see on the right. This is Samuel F.B. Morse's portrait of 1819 that hangs in the White House today. Monroe was 19 years old. He was during the Revolutionary War, he was a part of the crossing, and he was actually near fatally wounded during the Battle of Trenton. Moving on to the stern, you see the horses and heavy, a little bit closer, horses and the wheels of the cannon, the heavy artillery, are included in the painting. They didn't make the exact crossing with Washington, but they crossed at a different time and a different route to meet Washington and his men on the shores of New Jersey. But Loytza wanted to include them. And the two men huddled in the blanket and the skin are considered French and German farmers. Focus the sternsman for a moment. The sternsman, once considered a French-Canadian fur trapper, is now thought to be Native American. And notice the moccasins and the pouch, particularly once you compare his pouch with this 18th century Assiniboine bag that is part of the Diker collection at the Met. Now this is my thinking. This is all Alice. But if one looks at the plaster cast of George Washington and then the profiles and faces of the other men in the boat, one begins to see a resemblance and consistency. Did Loytza use the cast to replicate all of the men's faces? It certainly is easier for an artist to do that. But look at the repeated prominent nose, the very strong jawline that they all encompass. Loytza painted two versions of this painting, actually. He began the first one in 1849, immediately following the failure of Germany's own revolution. And he was working on the sky, this upper left-hand corner, when he noticed flames coming up through the floorboards of his second-floor studio. The canvas was ripped off of its internal frame, thrown out the window, and dragged away from the building, but very badly water damaged, and Loytza felt that he could not restore it properly. So he sells it to a German insurance company who gives him enough money to start in on version 2. This initial canvas was eventually destroyed during the Allied bombing raid in World War II. The insurance company sold it to the Bremen Museum, and in World War II, that first painting was destroyed. So Loytza began the second version of Washington Crossing the Delaware in 1850, the one that hangs at the Met. This later painting was transported to New York, where it was exhibited in a gallery in October of 1851 to rave reviews. And the who's who of New York City, along with 20,000 other New Yorkers, viewed the painting at the exhibition. And coincidentally, the following year, 250,000 Germans immigrated to New York City. In 1853, Marshall O. Roberts, a wealthy capitalist of New York and a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum, purchased the work for the then staggering price of $10,000. Loytza returns to Germany and continues painting. In 1859, Loytza moves back to America, settles in New York City for the rest of his life, and splits his time between New York and DC. Now, for our second painting. I'd like you to begin your eyes all the way in the distance in the upper right-hand corner, and slowly scan diagonally across the whole image. Again, think about Loytza's use of color, lighting, and composition. In 1861, Loytza completes Settlement of Maryland by Lord Baltimore, our second Romantic history painting. It's smaller in scale, it's a little bit more than 4 feet by 6 feet, but just as complicated, if not more so, and depicts a pivotal moment between the indigenous peoples of Maryland and a group of Europeans seeking religious freedom in the New World. Although there is less documentation as to Loytza's process, I can only surmise that he diligently studied this event and understood the importance of the establishment of the colony's first capital, St. Mary's City, in 1634. This is also not a commissioned work. He is painting it 227 years after the event, and let us keep in mind he's painting it in New York City at the outbreak of the American Civil War. Lincoln had been made president the year before, and the First Battle of Bull Run was sieged in Virginia, July of 1861. It is a vibrant, complex composition with dramatic light spotlighting the left half of the painting. The crowd is parting for us to see what is happening on the small platform to the left, while the beautiful reflective water takes our eyes off on the right and into the distance. Again, let us begin with the facts. In 1632, King Charles I granted Sir George Calvert, First Lord of Baltimore, the region east of the Potomac River in America. Maryland was to be an establishment for Catholic dissenters from England. English emigres would colonize in the New World for religious freedom, and in exchange, England would profit from the trade and natural resources of Maryland. Calvert dies before the settlement. The region is assigned to his son Cecil, but it is son Leonard, seen here, who is sent with the ships and passengers and becomes the first governor of Maryland. Now I'd like to look at this painting in quadrants. In the top right quadrant of the painting are 2 ships anchored offshore. They are the Ark and the Dove, which sailed from the shores of England in November the year before, down the coast of Europe, past the islands off of Africa, across to the Caribbean islands, to the shores of Virginia and east to Maryland. The Ark carried 140 Catholic and Protestant settlers with servants and some provisions, and the Dove, a much smaller ship, carried much of the cargo. The voyage took 3 months, and only 12 people perished due to illness. I think just on the shores you can see the delight of those that have just landed safely on the shores. Looking at the lower left-hand corner of the painting, Calvert was to purchase the land from the Piscataway and Yakima native peoples who had already inhabited the land for 13 generations. The Piscataway had lost much to the Spaniards in the 16th century, had property taken by the English at Jamestown. Note the Piscataway chief in the corner as the agreement of shaking hands happens on the platform. I think Loytza is reflecting both of not only the history of America, but also sort of the future escapades of what's to come. At a closer glance, Leonard is seen here with the Accomaco leader shaking on the deal. Another native rushes in to warn of this agreement, though Leonard has his hand over his heart, a gesture of being genuine. As a comparison, by 1861, it's very possible that Leonard's portrait was seen by Loytza. It was already in America, and it might have been used to create the figure in the painting. Hairstyle, facial features are quite similar. Father Andrew White, a Jesuit priest, is perhaps the most important figure in the painting. He made the crossing on the Ark, held the first Catholic Mass in Maryland to bless the land and the peoples, as you see that's happening here, and most importantly also wrote an extensive journal on the voyage and first arrival in Maryland with detailed descriptions of weather, the people, the land, and the climate. It was translated from his Latin into English and widely distributed by the 19th century. And again, I don't know if Loytza read the father's account. However, so much of the writing seems to be depicted in the painting. There are certain details that Father White mentions that Loytza seems to pick up on. In the lower right-hand corner of the painting, Loytza gives us the reason for choosing and settling Maryland. Yes, the warm climate year-round, but also the abundance of oysters, corn, fish, timber, livestock, indigo, cotton, and as Father White describes, quote, an abundance of springs afford water, the soil appears particularly fertile, and strawberries, vines, sassafras, hickory nuts, and walnuts we tread upon everywhere in the thickest woods. There is an infinite number of birds of various colors, as eagles, herons, swans, geese, and partridges, unquote. The women in the lower right-hand corner display and carry berries, oysters, deer, ducks, geese, rabbit, quail, and corn. The European men beyond them, as we see closer to the center of the painting, offer hatchets, printed cloth, and glass beads. One had to exchange goods to purchase inhabited land. In the background, across the top of the painting, Loytza incorporates a Tudor-style house under construction. You can see the Maryland flags on the right side. Away on the left. Both of these historical inaccuracies. Native Americans of this region lived in wood-constructed longhouses. They were not nomadic. Appropriate to the 17th century. But perhaps Loytza again is including these two to foreshadow the removal of one and the establishment of another. I think the comparison of these two, when most people hear the word indigenous peoples or Native Americans, they think of teepees and tents. Very, very different than the brick structure that you see on the right-hand side. The settlement of Maryland by Lord Baltimore was deposited to the Maryland Center for History and Culture in 1884 by Hollander, Bernheimer, and Bernheimer, a Munich-based family of art dealers and collectors founded in 1864. Washington Crossing the Delaware was donated to the Metropolitan Museum in 1897 by trustee John Stuart Kennedy. Today, I think Loytza would be very pleased to know his works are on view in such prestigious institutions open to the public. I do hope, as our worlds open up again, that you will have the opportunity to see both of Loytza's paintings live and have a fresh perspective and new way of looking at these extraordinary works. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alice, for that. For that deep dive into these works of art. And while we give our audience a moment to write their questions in the Ask a Question link at the bottom of your screen, I'm going to invite my colleague, Hilary Chang, back on screen with us for a moment. Welcome, Hillary.
Hi, Margot. Thank you, Alice. That was an incredible presentation. I was in art history in college, and that was really, really interesting and fun to learn. Um, so I wanted to give my sincere thanks to you all for supporting us and engaging with our public programs at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Your history lives here, and all of our programs are for you. It really puts a giant smile on our faces when we see new registrations come in and your comments, so it means a lot. It's also really incredible because of your participation and your support. We have already raised over $970 to our FSK from Home Giving Challenge. Thank you so much. That's particularly incredible because this is our first FSK of our new little mini series. So thank you so much to those who have donated, whether that was donating a previously purchased ticket or making a new contribution at registration or during the event today. Your support means so much. It enables us to present these programs, and it's also one of the many ways that you show us our work is relevant, interesting, and important. So I'll make my shameless plug again. If you haven't already, please consider making a donation by clicking the button below. And any amount helps, and every dollar goes directly to supporting our public programs like this. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Hillary. That is amazing news about our donations. And thank you, everyone out there. We're not done our program yet. We gave you a couple more minutes to ask a question for our guest, Alex. Alice. And in the meantime, Alice, so German-born artist Emanuel Leutze and his two paintings, one of which is owned, of course, you said, and on display here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. We spoke a little before the program today, and I knew that we were really in for a deep dive into these works by Loytza. You mentioned that Loytza really did do his historical homework before undertaking these pieces of art. Is that correct? Loytza really did do his homework. He looked at diaries, but probably not Father White's diary. But you have found that he really went above and beyond to do some historical research.
Yeah, it is true that in European and American standards for history painters, that there is always some research done. But I think for Loytza, particularly for Washington Crossing the Delaware, very well documented. I was a little surprised at how much research he did, how many times he came back to the United States during the process of even painting Washington Crossing the Delaware several times in order to increase his knowledge about the event itself. I'm not sure how many artists would ask for a replica of a uniform and come back to the States to make the crossing and really get a whole feel of the piece, even though we know that looking at both of these paintings that there are historical inaccuracies. But I hope I made the point at the very beginning that, artists even today, when you think about artists creating any kind of image online, in paint, in sculpture that is responding to COVID and Black Lives Matter and things that are happening now, to think how important that was to Loytze at the time, that his subject matter was, yes, responding very much to the time in which he was living, and then also responding like, how does that change my perspective of looking at a Revolutionary War image or settlers finding their new life in the new world?
Yes, that's a very good point to make, and tying it into modern day, Alice. And in fact, we do have a question about that. Let me see. It looks like D is asking if viewers at the time recognized the variety of backgrounds of the men in Washington's boat because that was really interesting to learn about.
It's an excellent question, Dee. And from what I have read at the time, even though it had rave reviews at that first exhibition in 1851, nobody was writing specifics, both critic and those that were applauding. Nobody was writing specifics as to who was in the boat and what they were seeing. I think the focus so much coming out in 1851, yes, he's responding to the German Revolution, but also let's keep in mind, even in the United States in 1851, the grumblings and leading up to the Civil War. There was no description that I'm aware of until well into the 20th century, in the 1960s and 70s, when scholars were first really grappling with who was included in the boat, and to as much as we know, matching that up with the different cultures, including indigenous peoples, that were part of the actual crossing.
That actually brings to another question that Paul out there is asking. He is saying that, is it fair to say between the two paintings that Loytza of Loytza, Loytza's view of Native Americans changed? So I guess what he's saying, from one passive agrarian to the other as active helpers of Washington. And did Loytza see Native Americans as oppressed, who would find liberty?
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I have not been able to find Loytza's response to the Native American, the indigenous people of America, as a separate group. But something that I was saying before, that what we do know about Loytza is, as far as his political view and his viewing, is that somebody needs to, in essence, be sort of trampled upon in order for success to happen for somebody else. And that's why I think this topic is very key to what's going on in our life right now. I think he thought of the Native Americans as a very strong culture. He seemed to appreciate the fact that they had no idea of land ownership, that utilizing the land is a way of occupying it, but there is no thought about literally owning land the way we think of it in a Western tradition. Some of his other works that obviously were not included in these two, but shortly after or shortly before the settling of Maryland painting, he does an enormous mural painting called Westward Ho. That is an abbreviated version of a very long title, but it is all about Europeans and colonial Americans moving west. And so it is, in order for progress to happen for the human, somebody has to give. And I would say that that's exactly what Loytza's feeling, that the indigenous people have to give. Another really well-known painting that he does before Washington crossing the Delaware is Cortez and the battle between Cortez and the Aztecs. And that is very much a physical struggle. It literally is a battle on the canvas, but that you can see that it is to the detriment of the Aztecs and ultimately the end of that culture. That was a very long answer to a good question, but
no, that is very, I mean, this is very interesting and also lends to its own virtual program and
yes.
discussion. We have also, since we have Mary Ann Eves asking, since Loytza did so much research for Washington crossing the Delaware, why is it that it is so often pointed out that the boats he showed are not the Durham boats produced in Pennsylvania beginning in 1750?
Yes.
That were flat bottom boats with higher sides than the Rhine boats depicted by Loytza. Boy, she knows her.
She does.
Her stuff.
And I probably could have gone into much more detail, but I'm glad she mentions it and brings it up, because the Durham boats were built with very high sides, literally, and the way that you transport yourself in a boat like that, originally built for fishermen, is standing in it. And I know that a lot of people who come to see Washington Crossing the Delaware at the Met, I mean, I've probably taught it at least 1,000 times in my life, and constantly hearing people like, no one's going to stand up in a boat. Well, actually, all of the men would have stood up in a boat. But I think the reason Loytze is not choosing it is not to be historically inaccurate, because he probably did know exactly what boats were used. But if you looked at this group of men, including Washington, crossing the Delaware in the of tiny little heads popping out of the top. Think to lower the boat to have it more of a typical rowboat, even of the 19th century, that this puts the statuesque main character, if you will, standing the highest in the boat, where everybody else is doing the work, and he obviously is the strategist, full profile, looking off to the shore of New Jersey where they're going to land. So I think it's an artistic choice to switch out the boats, but I think it's his choice in this boat is much more effective to draw our viewers' eyes to not only him, the main character, but the symbol of independence, the flag, which obviously is historically inaccurate, but he knew all of this. So it's, again, what do you include in a painting and what can you leave out to send the strongest message about what that particular moment in history meant for the greater whole of the culture and the time period. Thank you for asking that question.
That actually answers Alan's question, which he comments, it's not safe to stand on a rowboat. Why is Washington standing? So that takes care of that. Very interesting. I have a couple more questions we're going to get to. The next two are about the paintings in general. Ralph would like to know, was it unusual for a painter to do such a large painting without a commission? And was Loytza independently wealthy?
Oh, two very good questions. I'll answer the second one first. Independently wealthy for that time, he did very well as a portrait artist at the first half of his career, and particularly being based in Philadelphia, making some trips to New York, going down to DC. I would imagine he spent time also in Baltimore, Maryland. So he was tightly tagged with quite a number of wealthy art patrons and supported it as far as creating portraits for them, including some military portraits and including some political figures of the time period in the 19th century. There are a few Philadelphia men that helped support his way to get to Dusseldorf, to Germany at that time. And Julianne Lautner, that I mentioned he marries shortly after his Italian trip or his other European excursion, comes from a fairly wealthy family. So I'm sure she helped with it as well. So back to the first one, and I have to admit that when I first learned decades ago that Washington Crossing the Delaware, being nearly 14 by 22, was not a commissioned piece, that is the first thing that really hooked me into why would somebody create something of this size. That 800-pound canvas, as I mentioned, I hope I mentioned, that the insurance company actually paid Loytza $1,000 for that first painting. And $1,000 in 1850, 1851 was enough money for him to buy another 800-pound Irish linen and all of the paints and brushes and things like that that he needed to complete the second one, as well as, I would imagine, income in his pocket so that he could survive himself during the painting of it. But it's a very good question, and I think we often forget that even going back to the Renaissance, being an artist, particularly a painter or a sculptor, this is a business. Yes, you hope that you are lauded by your contemporaries, you hope that you're lauded by the art schools and the art patrons, and you hope that you become very successful and well known and sort of are counted in the art history books of the world. But when it comes down to it, you want to be paid for your work of art. And so it's baffling to me that he would commence on such an enormous canvas. The settlement of Maryland, I kind of get 4 feet by 6 feet or a little bit larger than that. That is a much more, those are the dimensions of a history painting, both in Europe and America, that is much more mainstream. And you don't obviously, all of the materials involved in creating a smaller painting don't cost the way it does for an immense painting. So I don't really have a direct answer as to why he would plunge in on something so large, except that he wanted to be accepted as an American artist. He wanted to be accepted by the American public. And I would imagine, thinking about coming off of the German Revolution and feeling so passionate about the strength and importance of humankind, that he thought this is a perfect example of a revolution, a successful revolution in America.
The last question that I'm going to ask you, Alex, is this. Charles asked, has the U.S. government actually ever tried to purchase or borrow Washington Crossing the Delaware for display at the U.S. Capitol or any other government building?
Not to my knowledge. I will say at the beginning of the 20th century, American history painting, particularly of that size, really goes out of favor. And so even the Metropolitan Museum of Art didn't have it on view for lengthy periods of time. It was then loaned, a long-term loan, to the Washington Crossing Museum that is down on the shores of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. So they had the painting on view there, ended up making a replica of the painting that the Met for the bicentennial asks for the painting back, and it comes back into the Met's collection in the middle of the 1970s. So Washington Crossing Delaware has never, to my knowledge, has never been asked. However, the Westward Ho painting that I mentioned, the very large canvas that shows westward expansion, is in the Capitol building in DC. They commissioned it, and so it hangs there. And I think, I would imagine in reading, I think Loytza for Washington Crossing the Delaware embarked on such a large painting in hopes that the U.S. government, the White House, would purchase it from him. But happy to say that shortly after that, he at least gets a commission from the U.S. Capitol, and it is still part of their collection.
I see. Yeah, you and I spoke a little bit about that during our meetings so far this program. Mm-hmm. It is just all very, very fascinating. There are other questions out there that we haven't got to, and we will give them to Alice to answer, and we will send them out with a recording of this program to you through email, probably about next week. And I just want to thank you so much, Alice, for starting this virtual series with us. And thank you everyone out there for being so patient with our program today. And Alice, it really is a pleasure to have you join us for this FSK from home.
Thank you so much. My absolute pleasure, and congratulations on your new rebranding. Very exciting.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all out there for joining us. Please consider donating toward this series and join us next month on October 1st at 4 p.m. with our guest author, Martha S. Jones, as she will be presenting Vanguard, How African American Women Led the Movement for Voting Rights. Until October 1st, We will see you soon. Thank you again, Alice. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.